Hello guys and welcome to a new episode of Italian Presidents. It is I, Ippernick the Great, and today we're talking about Sergio Mattarella. Today we are used to seeing politicians with little to no character. By that I don't mean that they can't have their merits and charm, but you don't really see anymore the politicians with the epic origin story which develops its personality. On one hand, that is understandable because life is certainly not a shitty anime where the main character wins the day with the power of friendship and orange juice or some shit. This is real life, but sometimes real life is way better than fiction, and there is no place where it is more true than in Italy. I have decided to dedicate this tangent to Sergio Mattarella because I honestly think he is one of the most intriguing, fascinating and inspiring people who have ever led this nation, and I have been looking forward to making this video for months. For this video I decided to do something different for a change. Whenever you will hear the sound, it will mean that I have already made a video on the person I just mentioned, and you will find it in the description. But if you hear this sound, it means that I've just mentioned someone I want to cover soon, and if you want to hurry up the process, be sure to comment the name of the politician in question, so I know you want to see it too. Without further ado, let us begin. Mattarella was born in 1941 in Palermo. His father, Bernardo, was a member of the constituency for Democrazia Cristiana, and his brother Piersanti too was a politician for the same party. Sergio would move to Rome in the 60s to attend the Sapienza University, where he studied law. After graduating, he began his academic career in the field of public law while also working as a lawyer back in Sicily. He will eventually become professor of parliamentary law and was considered one of the experts of bicameralism. Mattarella seemed to have a bright future ahead of him in academia and law, but then in 1980 something happened which caused him to make a U-turn and change his career forever. On the 6th of January, his brother Piersanti, who had been elected president of Sicily just 2 years before, was shot and killed by a mafia killer while he was driving to church with his family. In his long political career in the center-left current of DC, Piersanti had dedicated himself to the fight against the mafia, a battle which took his life. The news of the death of his older brother shocked Mattarella to the core, and eventually decided he will follow his brother's steps and become a politician too, and that's exactly what he did. By 1982, Mattarella, under the encouragement of the center-left leader of DC, Mita, endorsed the election to the Sicilian regional branch of DC of a certain Giuseppe Campione, who ran against Salvo Lima. Lima might sound familiar to the OGs who watched my previous videos, but he was a center-right member of Democrazia Cristiana, who was initially very involved with the mafia, but was eventually shot when his friend and Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti switched sides and decided to fight against them. Of course, Lima the tool was the one who suffered the consequences of that decision firsthand. In 1983, Mattarella will be elected into parliament, getting nearly 120,000 votes in the Western Sicilian constituency. Now a parliamentarian, Mattarella worked to undermine the mafia's influence in Sicilian politics with the Mita and the future mayor of Palermo, Leoluca Orlando, who will leave the DC in the early 90s to make an anti-corruption party which served as inspiration for the Five-Star Movement. By 1987, Mattarella will be elected once more with 140,000 votes this time, and when the Mita became party secretary and later prime minister, he was nominated Minister of Parliamentary Relations. Then, when Andreotti came to power, he was made Minister of Public Education. He did a lot of reforms regarding the school program. One thing in particular that screams early 90s is the anti-drug program, which educated high schoolers about drugs and stuff. He was minister for little less than a year before he resigned alongside some of his colleagues in protest of the Mummy Law, which was one of a long series of laws to regulate private television. This one in particular was particularly favorable to Silvio Berlusconi, the entrepreneur who became one of the richest people in Italy thanks to television, and who will later use his platforms to win the 1994 elections. I talked about Berlusconi many times, but his specific video on him is not very good, so I hope to redo it soon. Now you should see an ad or 3 seconds of black screen. Let's find out. I hope that was an ad, because I like money. Anyway, between 1993 and 1994, most of the leaders of the First Republic were getting cancelled by the justice system in the big judicial campaign of Clean Hands, led by the magistrate Antonio Di Pietro. In order to regain credibility, many members of the old establishment passed referendums and reforms to address the problems the country was facing. Mattarella addressed probably one of the more important ones, the electoral system. His electoral law will be named Mattarellum and will be used from 1994 to 2001. Essentially, 25% of the seats were distributed proportionally, while the remaining 75% followed a majority system. The previous law was 100% proportional, and people did not think it represented them enough. Understandably so. A lot of people actually look at Mattarellum nostalgically. I can't really do that because I barely had self-consciousness when it was used, but I definitely see its merits. Mattarella did not do much at the beginnings of the Second Republic. He mostly fought against Cossiga, another former colleague from DC, which had now split in small parties. He was among the founders of the new Popular Party, which was made out of the center-left Christian Democrats. His first real institutional role in the Second Republic came in 1999, when Massimo D'Alema became Prime Minister. In his first cabinet, he will be his Deputy Prime Minister with a special delegation to the Secret Services, and in his second cabinet, he will be Minister of Defense. At the time, Italy was involved in the Allied force operation in Yugoslavia, so Mattarella played a very important role in that regard. When he was first elected president, I remember a lot of people being upset that the head of state was now a man who had bombed Serbia back in the day, but I remember telling them to cut him some slack, because after all, who hasn't committed multiple war crimes in their youth? Am I right, guys? After being in parliament for a few more years, Mattarella will be elected judge of the Constitutional Court in 2011 under the encouragement of President Giorgio Napolitano. During his term as constitutional judge, another big transition took place in Italy. In 2013, the two coalitions and the balance between them, which had characterized the political environment for almost 20 years, had now been broken by the Five Star Movement, and technically the Mario Monti coalition too, but nobody remembers that. The parliament was in no shape to make a decision, and so Napolitano had no choice but to be re-elected president for a second term, something unseen before then. After just a few years, the parliament had found a new balance, all thanks to Matteo Renzi, who became party secretary of the Democratic Party in 2014, and since then dragged the previously Social Democratic Party of the country into something more liberal. This new orientation favored cooperation between the center-left and the center-right in many occasions. One of these was certainly the 2015 presidential election, the same election that made Mattarella our president. Renzi was actually the one who suggested him, and everyone liked that idea. Sure, there were some dissidents who did not want Mattarella there because of stuff he did under D'Alema, or just because he was not racist enough, but overall there was some pretty good initial feedback, especially when they heard about his brother getting killed by the mafia. He quickly won national sympathy over that. The first 2 years of his term were not particularly eventful for him, and that's because Renzi ran the show pretty much until the 2018 elections. Probably the most interesting event that happened at the time was the 2016 constitutional referendum, so let me tell you about that. This referendum was about abolishing the Senate and to break the bicameral system. According to Renzi, this would have saved Italy a lot of money and sped up the legislative process. A lot of people were not very convinced at first, which is understandable at the time, but as a person who has experienced far worse, I find it difficult to sympathize. I will get more into it later. At the time, Renzi was relatively popular, so he thought to make a gamble. He said, if this referendum doesn't pass, I will resign from prime minister. This was pretty bad, because now all the people who did not care about the referendum because they did not like Renzi were going to vote no just to see him resign, and that is exactly what happened. 40% of the voters said yes. Ironically, that was the PD's polling scores back then, so yeah, he had personalized a referendum, and that's never a recipe for success. Actually, very recently we had a referendum to cut in half the total number of parliamentarians while still keeping the bicameral system, and this reform, despite being very poorly written, actually won, so that's the thing. On the 5th of December 2016, Renzi gave Mattarella his resignation papers, which he refused, saying that he should pass the early financial law first. And Renzi was like, oh shit, I forgot, and he did it and resigned like 3 days later again. To succeed Renzi will be Paolo Gentiloni, and yes, you did not hear any sound because he's boring. His government will basically be a slightly disappointing sequel to Renzi's cabinet. Really, the only person worth mentioning is the Interior Minister Marco Minniti, who I technically have never made a video on, but I mention him every single time I talk immigration because it is almost inevitable. Yeah, the immigration crisis was also a big deal at the time, and Minniti basically solved it by making deals with the Libyan human traffickers. It was morally lacking, but it was still better than whatever Salvini quote-unquote accomplished, no matter how many poorly designed graphs and prints he shows off at public debates. Oh, speaking of Salvini, let's talk about the 2018 elections. In 2018, Italians went to the polls and the parliament was elected. The Five-Star Movement had won the relative majority of the seats, while the Lega was now the leader of the center-right coalition, taking over for Berlusconi. After a long period of negotiations, Luigi Di Maio from the Five-Star Movement and Matteo Salvini from Lega selected Giuseppe Conte to be the new prime minister, and together they created a list of ministers. Conte's first cabinet was going to be the most anti-establishment, anti-Europe, and most populist government the country has ever seen. When Mattarella saw the list of ministers, he was at first reluctant to accept, but then he had a look at who was put at the Ministry of Economics, and finally he had made his mind up. Fuck this government, make a new one. That is basically what he said. Who was going to be Minister of Economics? A certain Paolo Savona, economist, academic, and hardcore Eurosceptic. This man bragged about writing a paper on how to get Italy out of the Eurozone in a fucking weekend. Placing this man in arguably the most important ministry in the cabinet would have destroyed Italy's international credibility, and therefore Mattarella refused to take Conte's oath. While very unusual, this is very legal and pretty much explicit on the constitution. But when this happened, the Five-Star Movement threatened to impeach the president, similarly to how Pelosi did with Trump, except she had actually the guts to do it. Di Maio, on the other hand, probably did not even know what it meant. Mattarella gave zero fucks about peaches though, and he called for another plausible prime minister called Cottarelli, who is a bright economist. Mattarella was about to offer him the premiership when Conte came back with a new cabinet, where Savona was just put at the Ministry of European Affairs and Giovanni Tria was put in Savona's stead. I have no clue who he is. That was good enough for Mattarella though, and made Conte take the oath.